So yeah, today we're going to talk about pandemic boundaries. So this whole month we've been talking about setting healthy boundaries with folks, and I think that's so important in preventing, since this is Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. I think this topic is really important to acknowledge because we are going through an unprecedented time right now where the pandemic has changed a lot about our relationships. And this is kind of a presentation to discuss what are some of the challenges in relationships and how do we adjust our boundaries based on different environmental factors. And I think especially physical distancing, mask wearing, not being able to hug people has been really hard for a lot of folks. And it's really led to a lot of isolation for a lot of people. So, and this really plays into how do we support people in teen dating violence relationships, because a lot of students aren't in school right now. A lot of teens aren't able to go into those support systems that they would normally go into. So this presentation is going to discuss a lot about how the pandemic has affected our relationships and how do we cope with that kind of situation. We don't have the answers, though we are very experienced at presenting on topics like this, but it's kind of an example of how different situations changes within the context of domestic violence and dating violence. So this is something, I'm going to go on to the next slide. So just a few discussion agreements that I think are super important to start before we really get into the topic for this presentation. So first of all, practicing self-focus, attending and sharing about your own experiences and responses, and avoiding sharing for folks on a whole group scale and expressing assumptions about an entire group. So I find it helps to not make overgeneralizations when I talk about my own experience rather than experiences of others. Intent versus impact, understanding the differences and understanding I may have meant to well, or I might have meant to help someone, but sometimes something I might say might show maybe I think I'm better than them, or sound like I think I'm better than them, or being condescending. So understanding that impact, I still caused harm, even though I meant well, is so important. And it helps us improve on our behavior and understand what really supports others, especially those who experience dating violence, and we might not know exactly what they are experiencing. Trying it on, brave face. So trying on new perspectives, thinking about what would happen if I was in this person's shoes. That could be really helpful. Be willing to try on new ideas, new perspectives that you may not be familiar with, and creating a brave space. Another one is moving up, moving back. So I encourage you, I know I'm the type of person that doesn't really like to participate in class discussions. When I'm in classes, I tend to just kind of step back. So I try to push myself to speak more, so if you find that you're the type of person that tends to always talk a lot, then maybe you can step back. But since we have such a small amount of people, I don't think that will be a problem too much. And so I encourage full participation from everybody. And what is said here stays here, what is learned here leaves here. And I think that's such an important one. The confidentiality piece is always ask people about their reporting requirements or confidentiality aspects of the space, because I think it's important to establish that expectation, especially if someone wants to share something really sensitive. A lot of times we might have someone that wants to share about a dating violence experience, but also being aware of, for example, me and Chris are mandatory reporters. We're required to report situations of child abuse or abuse of a vulnerable adult. So just having that, asking people those questions before you disclose a situation is really important, just so it doesn't take you by surprise. And that could be really traumatizing sometimes, to have something taken out of your hands before you know what will happen to it with that information. Right to pass, understanding that you can share via chat, or say, if I call out for people's participation, I'm not forcing anyone to participate, because I know this is a topic that could be very sensitive for a lot of folks. And especially when we talk about trauma like dating violence and the pandemic, I know that talking about it sometimes can be really hard for folks, especially if you just experienced it, or revisiting some of those things is very like hard for you. So no pressure to participate, though I do encourage it. And invite yourself to take breaks and care for yourself if anything gets too much for you. I know sometimes something might be triggering and we might not even realize it. So feel free to take a break if you need to, or shut off the Zoom if you need to right now. That's so important to take care of yourself. And if you need support and you feel like you're in an unhealthy relationship at any point during this presentation, I put our 24-hour support line up top, and it'll connect you to advocates at shelter or people at shelter that are trained to kind of direct you to folks in our organization to help you. Maybe if you need help with housing or legal advocacy, that's another aspect of that's kind of a thing, or shelter. That's another part where you can find out more information about that too. Anything to add, Chris?
No, as somebody who has a tendency to speak a lot in class, as far back as that was, and in presentations, I always take this moment to take a step back myself and make sure that I'm listening instead of just kind of waiting for my time to talk. So just to give the other side of that perspective. And Gina, just a quick FYI, we are getting a little crackling from your mic towards the end of that slide there. So you might want to reset or do the magic that you do to fix that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Is that better?
No, it's worse.
I think my speaker's not working. Oh, that wasn't my mic. Let me check real quick.
Is that better?
It seems to be better so far.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, just let me know if the audio gets weird at any point, because I know that it's hard to participate if you don't know what I'm saying. So that's helpful. So
it has been pointed out you sound a little far away, but
okay.
I think that's a little bit better than the crackling that we were getting before. So
okay, good to know. Okay, yeah, let me know if that gets any more crackly for you guys. So one thing is, before we get started, I want to say that we're not public health experts at all. We actually specialize more in domestic violence, dating violence. So if you need more information about COVID-19 regarding the pandemic, I would urge you to go to the CDC website to find out more, since they have the most updated information, especially since there's so many new develops now with the variants, COVID-19 variants, and the vaccines. So I urge you to go and find out more about the virus itself. But we're just going to be talking about the relationship aspect that the pandemic has imposed on a lot of folks. So, and if you have any public health knowledge, if anyone has public health knowledge that would be helpful to the presentation that you want to contribute, feel free to put that in the comments. So that's something. And if you want to raise your hand at any point too, feel free to do that to contribute, because I know we have a smaller group today, so that's really great that we can be more engaged discussion wise. So one thing is, COVID-19 has an effect on dating violence, and it's really created a lot of different issues. So a lot of times couples who experience severe distress are at greater risk of violence than non-distressed couples. And I know while this is not focused on teens, it really points to a fact that there are a lot of hardships for teens who are dating right now, especially during the pandemic. They might not be able to see their significant others, since I know a lot of teens might not live with their significant other at this point in time. They might live somewhere else. And that kind of stress in the relationship can really exacerbate situations of abuse and power and control in a lot of different ways. And there's not a lot of studies out there about teens, I will admit. That's something that is kind of a struggle right now, because there's so much new information, but kind of brainstorming, thinking of different ways that teens are impacted by this, because I know if I was a teen right now, I would be having a hard time because I can't see my friends. I can't see a lot of different people. So understanding what different stressors are there are super important to the relationship. and understanding risk factors in the pandemic. So one big thing I didn't know for a long time was that violence, including intimate partner violence, increases during humanitarian crises and emergencies. And that's something that I never really thought of, but it is very, if you think about it, it's a lot of different factors, a lot of access to resources and things like that. Um, can be very difficult during a crisis like this. Like who has access to masks, and the fact that who's not wearing a mask, and how do you interact with those folks, or understanding those different factors and how they impact our relationships are so important. Um, Anything you wanted to add about these studies, Chris?
Yeah, so like Gina mentioned, there's not a ton of information around teen dating violence in the pandemic right now and during distress. But one thing we do know that is happening during the COVID-19 pandemic is we also know that alcohol consumption has risen throughout America. And alcoholism does not cause domestic violence. It is definitely a confounding factor when it comes to domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
So the scenarios in which domestic violence, especially the greater risk episodes occur, are much more likely to be in place during this pandemic than they were before. We've got a couple different studies, one out of Spain, that's the first real longitudinal Big N study that talked about how DV has gone up. And a lot of experts in the field believe that DV has also increased more than before. But those are smaller studies and we don't have those definitive numbers yet. One thing we do know is that everyone knows life is a little different now, and thus there's going to be some changes in the way we interact with each other no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's hard to get information right now since it's only been like about a year since the pandemic started. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at a lot of these different studies, that, and also a lot of times DV situations before the pandemic don't really reflect what's happening now. That may not be as relevant right now. So just keeping that in mind, and especially when we look at a lot of the topics that we discussed last time. I'm gonna actually turn off my video just because I think there's a connection thing that's happening with me. It's making it slower, so we'll see if that's helpful in connectivity. Let me know if my audio sounds weird. So one thing is adapting our boundaries and understanding how we adapted boundaries differently and how has that impacted relationships. And I just want to kind of reflect on our last 3 workshops. I know a lot of us may not have been at the last 3 workshops, but if you want to, it's on our YouTube channel. Feel free to take a look at them. They should be posted up by the end of, not too quickly after this month. I'll put them up as soon as possible. So keep checking in on the channel. I'll also put a follow-up email for the YouTube channels. But one thing is thinking about how the pandemic has influenced our breakup and rejection boundaries, because I know we're rejecting people a lot right now if we're not breaking up, right? One thing is that maybe we might be saying, hey, I don't feel comfortable seeing you in person right now. That's a form of rejection that a lot of people are dealing with. And I know even some of my family members have been struggling with this, because I had a family member that wanted to stay with us at one point, and my parents are very public health conscious and they're at risk folks too. So they were like, how do we do this? So I think that's a big thing that we're all kind of trying to figure out. How do we stay socially distanced without actually isolating ourselves from these people, right? Because we still care about people. We don't want it to seem like we don't care, especially with COVID bubbles right now. There's a huge feeling of rejection if you're not in someone's COVID bubble, right? You're like, sorry, I'm only seeing these few people. And for another person, that might feel hurtful to them. So understanding how we frame rejection in another sense. and being able to take that rejection too, and understanding the reasons behind it. Because I know from the other side of the person rejecting, they might be thinking, oh, I just want to make sure that that person might be high risk. Maybe you're a high risk person. They don't want to give you the virus or transmit the virus to you. So, kind of thinking about those different things, maybe they didn't choose these people to be in their circle just because they'd like them better than you. Maybe they care about your well being as well as everyone else's in their household, too. So, that's something to kind of think about in terms of these different ways. And if you have any other ideas of ways that you've seen breakup and rejections during the pandemic and how that's changed. I know one thing is a lot of people stress during a breakup, you have to break up in person. But a lot of times I've noticed that a lot of people are figuring out right now, it's either the make or break for a lot of people because going through such a difficult time where there's a lot of barriers in place. You can't go out to restaurants. A lot of our social venues are kind of closed down. But I know it's recently opened up. But also understanding, you're seeing this person for the first time deal with struggles maybe in your relationship, and you realized, oh, I don't think this person copes with this relationship during hard times in a way that I feel like I can deal with, right? So that's something to think about, is how breakups and rejection have really come to light during this time. Anything you wanted to add about that, Chris?
No, I think your point about the bubbles and the rejection just on a very basic social level is a really good one. I know that so my wife was pregnant during the majority of this pandemic, and during that time we had to severely limit our time with other people, and it's hard. And luckily rejection isn't a rejection necessarily of self, but a rejection rather of this scenario. And so, it's a good way to think about things both in the breakup sense and in the COVID sense. It's not rejecting you as an individual, it's rejecting you as this scenario, you and your part in it. And I know that's really hard sometimes to not take personally, but COVID has shown us it's not a personal thing. It's just kind of where we're at.
Yeah, and it's like even sometimes like that distance shows that that person really does care about you. If they're willing to stay away from you for so long, maybe that just shows how much they care about your well-being and health as well. It's really kind of how we frame things and our perception of that rejection that's important to really look at during that time. So, and a huge thing too is the digital boundaries. I think that's our level of digital interaction has increased so much. I didn't even use Zoom before the pandemic. I just learned how to use Zoom recently for work because I did a lot of presentations. I used to go into schools, and I found that we're finding different ways to interact online that have different nuances. I know that there's been a lot of jokes about how you interact on Zoom, different types of people on Zoom, and another thing that has kind of increased is like trying to get people to respond back. Like maybe people are sending you messages while you're in class, or maybe people are sending you messages when you're doing something else, you're spending time with family. And having those digital boundaries can be really important to have for your mental health too, because I know that sometimes when I look at social media, I scroll through Reddit a lot. Sometimes I scroll through Reddit until 2 a.m. in the morning, and I'm like, yeah, this is not good, because I'm constantly exposed, especially if there's like a lot of negative news, especially about coronavirus and things like that. And that kind of, I know sometimes there's a fear factor there. Taking breaks from that can really help. Especially, I notice that I get more irritated with people when I spend too much time online. So that's really important. Or maybe going online and looking at funny memes rather than the news all the time. That calms me down a little bit. I'm like, oh, this is hilarious. I love it. So that's kind of like what you engage with digitally is so important, and how you engage with people digitally is important, because I know a lot of times nuances and what people say through text can be interpreted differently than in person, like facial expressions and things like that are very different. And that's why I like to keep my camera on a lot of times. Sorry, I had to turn it off because it's getting a little crackly. But I always try to keep my camera on during presentations because I feel like it connects with people and they can see my nuance, because I'm sarcastic. I'm a sarcastic person. But sometimes, like, I know that my sarcasm through text can come off as, I hate you, or that kind of idea. So that's something to really keep in mind, is the way we interact, and how do we interact differently through text and social media, through our stories differently. Family boundaries. What are some new household limits? I know, especially for teens, there's a lot of new household rules now, maybe because of social distancing. Maybe you're not allowed to go out like you used to with your friends, and kind of experience your teenhood. And I know that's been taken from a lot of teens out there, and it's very difficult, because I know I know that my boyfriend's brother had to skip his prom, and he didn't get to go to prom, and that was something. I know, like, prom isn't everything. I look back at my prom and I'm like, oh, that wasn't that great. It wasn't such a big deal, but I know it's such a big deal to a lot of young people out there, and it's a milestone, and I'm grateful I had the experience, even though I didn't really think it was that great, so those kinds of social, I know that that's maybe the only social landscape that you have to experience relationships too. Like, going with your date and going through all those motions can be really important for a lot of young people too. So that's something that I know is kind of an outlet for you to do that. So that could be very difficult to have. Anything you wanted to add there, Chris?
Yeah, I think you touched on something that's really important that we actually haven't talked about a lot in this series, but something I do kind of want to bring up. And that's setting boundaries for yourself and the practice of doing so. So you were talking about doom scrolling, basically, and how, like, you recognize that staying up till 2 a.m. and reading the latest news just kind of bummed you out, made you antisocial. It was a struggle. So you can set boundaries for yourself. You can set, so all of these things that we've talked about this week, these boundaries that we're setting, you can also practice with yourself. Rejection, understanding of who you are, like, as a human being, things about yourself that you wish you could improve. If you can have those conversations with yourself honestly, they become easier to have with other people honestly. If you can set boundaries with yourself, I'm not staying up until 2 a.m., then you can set digital boundaries with somebody else. So there's definitely some benefit on creating self boundaries, and just the ones that you feel are appropriate for when you're setting boundaries outside of the relationship you have with yourself.
Yeah, that's such an important piece to it. Like, if you play an instrument, like, I was an orchestra kid, so I used to practice the violin on my own before I went out and, like, performed during a school performance or something like that. That's something that we all know. Oh yeah, you practice that on your own first, and then you can do that with other folks. Show what you have to other people. It's kind of like that. You're preparing for kind of that I know for romantic relationships, it's all about preparation, using family boundaries to prepare for romantic relationships, using your own relationship with yourself to practice for relationships. And I think that really brings into, I'll bring it up a little bit later, is that mental health piece too, is working on your mental health first before you get into a relationship with someone. Because I think I'm sure, like, a lot of teens have heard this as a broken record, that you got to love yourself before you love someone else. And I'm like, when I was younger, I used to be like, huh, sure, yeah, always that message. But I think there is a lot of truth to it. You do have to practice on your own first before you go out there, and so you feel more prepared and you have more of a foundation of, this is an idea of what I want, but it might change to later flexibly, but I at least have a foundation before I go into it, right? So yeah, that's a really great point, is that self-practice kind of idea. So another thing I want to talk about is boundaries with the general public, that I don't think a lot of people have encountered this before the pandemic, is that you realize that a lot of your life depends on other people that you don't even know, that you just encounter, that are just people that just pass by and you don't think twice about them, right? But now we've sort of had to start thinking about where you're going. And I know that causes a lot of anxiety for a lot of folks. Like, what do I do if I know for myself, I live in an apartment complex where nobody wears a mask. And it's really like giving me a lot of anxiety. Like sometimes when I take my dog out for a walk, I like run outside and I'm like, okay, I got to get out before someone comes, you know? So that's something to kind of think about, is what are some boundaries you can set for the general public? And I think we're all a little bit terrified of talking to people we don't know or standing up to people we don't know. We're a lot more comfortable standing up to people that we do know because we feel comfortable with that person. But we don't know who that person is, that we go to the grocery store and we see that person, or we go, and I know a lot of schools are opening up or trying to open up. So when you go to school, what do you do when like maybe your classmate isn't wearing their mask properly, or not wearing their mask over their nose, or someone just in the hallways that you see? That's really important to think about. And, you know, you could think about maybe, you know, offering resources, maybe saying, hey, do you have a mask? You know, carrying around a few clean masks with you, and, you know, offering them to people first. I think that's like a really great strategy that I've seen, is just, you know, a lot of people just say, hey, do you need a new mask? Because sometimes maybe that person might just have, like, you know, messed up their last mask, they contaminated it and don't really have another one with them, and it's better to, you know, throw it away than use it again. So maybe like thinking about why that person might not be wearing a mask can be important. um, Trying to keep your distance from the other person, because you don't have control of that other person, but maybe you can stay away from that person if you can. I know that's hard. Sometimes you have to go out and do something, especially if you're at school. You have to be at school sometimes, or you might be required to be at school. So you know, talking, and I think that other part about seeking help from authority will come into play there, is that maybe talk to a teacher, like, this person's not wearing a mask, or an administrator, or, you know, another friend. Maybe that person can help back you up, because, you know, when you have people in numbers that say, hey, do you mind wearing a mask or something like that? But I think the first approach would be offering resources, because that's, you know, the kinder way and empathetic way to deal with things. And understanding the risk, like in your area too, because I know that, you know, rates are going down, but also we still have to be careful as well. So that's really important. So understanding the risk of being there, you know, maybe if they're far enough away, you can just, you know, go to the other end of the store, or you could go to the other end of the classroom, or if you're allowed to choose your seats. But if you're required to sit next to somebody, that's might be where you might want to seek help from an authority, if that person refuses to do just that, you know, after you've tried all those measures first. Anything you wanted to add, Chris? I know, like, you might have a different experience with the pandemic as well in this respect.
No, I think that's a really good breakdown. When when you're in a position where somebody's not necessarily following the guidelines that you personally feel are prudent, physical distancing, leaving, risk assessment, those are generally the best ways of creating those boundaries that you need to create. So no.
Yeah, no, it's definitely kind of, it's never a right answer, right? Because a lot of times we have to frequent, and especially if that authority figure decides not to enforce those kinds of measures that make you feel safe, that could be very difficult. And one thing you could kind of choose to do is say, hey, you know what? I don't think I'm going to come back to the store, you know, or maybe I'll go to a different store or something like that. Or maybe consider, you know, if you really don't feel safe, transferring schools. That's something that I know is easier said than done. I know that's a difficult thing to do. Maybe you could even invest. I know that these can be hard to access, but like different types of masks that make you feel comfortable wearing two masks, even. I would check the CDC website just to make sure, all of that is accurate, public health guidelines, right? So yeah, just make sure that you double check those measures, that make sure that you feel as safe as possible, because I know a lot's outside of people's control when you're dealing with the general public in that sense. So I want to kind of segue into dating boundaries, because I know that for dating, there are a lot of different considerations you might want to think about, like COVID-19 precautions and expectations, like mask wearing, physical distancing. Another thing you could think about is forming a COVID bubble, right? I know a lot of folks, since restrictions have kind of, relaxed, there's ideas around having certain people that you see and they only see you and you only see them, and it's like your specific bubble. So that you don't spread it to other folks that you might encounter. So thinking about those different things, maybe you can, your family or whoever you live it with might be okay with you just meeting a few people that also haven't been seeing other people. But I would just make sure that that's good practice from the CDC website as well. And another thing is digital boundaries in light of our increased reliance on technology. And I mentioned a little bit about it before. And also, I know a lot of times lack of in-person connection, physical connection, there's a lot of vulnerability for sexting. And, that might be a way that, teens might feel like, hey, this is how we can connect emotionally through our relationship. But a lot of times that could be taken advantage of in an abusive relationship, and it can turn into revenge porn, where folks might, without consent, post sexual images of the other person online, or threaten to do that online, to exert control over somebody. So in dating violence situations, that could happen a lot, this type of digital manipulation and control. And understanding screen fatigue, taking breaks from technology. It's funny because I'm the worst person to say, hey, you need to take a break from the screen. And my eye doctor the other day was saying, hey, Gina, you need to take a few breaks, if you could look away from the screen every now and then, because she's like, your eyesight is getting worse. And I was like, oh, that's a good advice, because she was realistic. She's like, you need to use the screen for work and school. So here's an idea. So taking breaks is important, not saying eliminate it from your life, because we all kind of rely on it in a lot of ways. But also clear communication. Text can be misinterpreted, like I mentioned. Like that, it's funny because I was reading a court case the other day where there was the judge was really excited about these emojis that were being used, and they were talking about the context of it, and it was so exciting for them. And it was funny because emojis are used a lot to express emotions, but sometimes it can be misinterpreted. It's not the clearest type of communication. So when there's a conflict or something someone said, and you have to really reflect on why you're upset with what they said, maybe you could clarify first. Say, is this what you meant by this text? Or call them, give them a call and say, hey, I got this text from you and it's kind of troubling to me. Is this what you meant by that? Because sometimes I know sometimes it's easy to catastrophize what someone says. It's very easy. I'm a very dramatic person. Sometimes I could be like, oh my gosh, this person hates me. But then I learn to, calm down a little bit and be like, oh, okay, they don't really hate me. They just use a different emoji that I don't understand. So it's kind of that analysis that we have to kind of take a moment and kind of think a little more, talk to more people about it, clarify what's been said. One thing is that I've noticed, I don't know if anyone's experienced subtweets a lot or seen subtweets. I know when I was in high school, I saw a lot of people posting on Twitter or Facebook more about, a certain person that they're talking about that they're upset with. Some people don't know how to be respectful or something. And some people know who they're talking about, and then other people are like, who are they talking about? What is this? What's happening? And that could be really bad for a relationship, because you're kind of airing your issues in relationships on social media, where it's not really the best way to resolve conflict, because the other person gets mad and defensive about it. So just being clear about what you mean and talking to the right people about it to make sure that things are okay. And I know sometimes in abusive relationships, That's not always safe to do, to talk directly to, for example, your abuser. That's definitely not safe. Thinking about ways we interact, I know maybe even posting publicly for a survivor about their abusive situation might not be the safest as well, too. Thinking about those contexts or posting pictures of other people and where they are, where their location is. That's kind of, I'll definitely check out the digital boundaries, that PowerPoint that we have on the YouTube channel to kind of, familiarize yourself a little bit more with those kind of abusive aspects digitally too. But those have, I feel like they definitely could be escalated a lot more during the pandemic, since that's where we interact the most. Family expectations and boundaries, living, especially if you live with people who are older or high risk, that's really difficult, because maybe you feel like you're low risk, and that can be hard because you don't want to infect these people because you want to go out and socialize with other folks. So that's something to really be aware of. How does your family feel about you seeing your dating partner, right? Do they feel comfortable with that? Do they feel safe with that? Because that might be, it might sound like they are trying to limit you or restrict you, but a lot of times it's just because maybe they are scared for their own health or safety. So making sure everyone in the family feels safe with the level of interaction with other folks outside of the household is important. Um, Respectful conflict responses to stress. So be flexible and understanding with each other. Because I think during these times, especially in family situations, if you're with each other all the time, you get irritated with people. And if maybe your partner doesn't want to meet again, I know a lot of people are getting exhausted with the physical distancing part of things. It's exhausting. I know, I'm tired of it too. I want to see people, right? And so one thing is that just be understanding that you're both in this together, and it's a difficult situation. You can be frustrated, but just make sure you're not taking frustration out on each other, because I think one thing is, it's so easy to snap now because you're in the house all the time, or you might just be tired of online school, right? I definitely get that. That's totally, understandable, but watching the way it impacts our relationship with other people, and realize, maybe this person, and also be aware if someone else is, if that person doesn't have access to healthcare, maybe that they might be more scared of contracting COVID in that sense, because I know a lot of folks might not have access to that. So just understanding why you can't do certain things in the relationships is really important during this time. Anything you wanted to add, Chris?
Yeah, so to toss on the adult ally hat here for a second, I want to come back to the revenge porn through sexting. One thing that I've run into while talking with survivors, and especially women survivors who have teenagers, is this idea of sexting seems foreign, kind of, or at least sending pictures of yourself through the media. Or through digital technology. It's a foreign concept, and to an adult brain, it just seems like a no-brainer. It just seems easy. What I always remind parents of is it's not the same. We're not in the same generation as teens now. We didn't grow up with the same technology. And I don't care how old you are. If you're over 20, you did not grow up with the same ubiquitousness of technology that teens today are growing up with. And so what's a natural part of a teenager's life is this sort of thing. I bring it up because we definitely want to support people who are going through something like revenge porn. And we want to make sure that they have the support that they need to get through a very hard time. So while the instinct is to not understand why somebody would put themselves in that position, please do understand that that's not the most important feeling. The most important feeling is offering support and love to somebody who's in a tough spot and doing what you can to help them through that tough spot. So I just want to bring that up. I did talk about this a little bit. I think, Gina, was that our first conversation? I think we were talking about some of the revenge porn, but I do want to bring that up again, that please support the people in your life that are going through this instead of victim blaming in this sort of situation.
And I think a better helpful thing to do is kind of focus more on the person that distributed those photos non-consensually, because I think consent is really important in this respect, is that this person trusted this other person to not share this photo of them. And that person knew what they were doing. I don't think anyone would, think that, oh, you sent this to me. Oh, I should send it to everyone else. That's just generally not a nice thing to do.
Yep.
So I think that's where our outrage and frustration can go more so, is like, why would you do this? Why would you send out those photos to everyone else rather than focusing on the person that trusted this other person to not betray them in that way?
Yep.
And I think for a lot of teens, this was supposed to be private. This is something that they just meant for this one person to see. And unfortunately, this person took advantage of their trust. And while I don't advocate, I don't ever think it's a good idea to sex generally, but I also recognize that that's not me. That's not, that's just a different perspective. So rather than shaming people, I do completely think, Chris hit that really important point of saying, we really have to, and also I think we're in a situation, if a teen were to come to me and say, hey, I had this situation where someone shared photos with me and I don't know what to do, I think I want to focus on future actions that we can do rather than say, why did you do that? That kind of idea of what can we do now that this has happened.
Yep. Absolutely. Gina, I do have to sign off. Everyone, thank you so much for watching the video / being here in person. Gina might talk about this at the very end, but Domestic Violence Services of Snohomish County Prevention Department is going to be launching a weekly workshop. That'll be launching in March. So if you're interested in more of what Gina has to say, more about teen dating awareness and healthy relationships, if you have interest in domestic violence services and what we offer to the community, please check those out. We will start advertising those in March, and we really hope people are able to be there. And there is going to be a lot of interaction with anybody who's available. So we're very much looking forward to that. Any chance we get to have Gina talk to people, we take advantage of. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching these videos. Gina, sorry, I know you've got more to talk about. That sounded like an ending. This isn't over. Gina's got more to talk about today. I'm just taking off. Thank you, Gina.
No, thanks, Chris. Yeah, no, Chris has a lot of great perspective to put into a lot of the information we discussed. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. Go ahead and go on to your doctor's appointment.
All right. Bye.
Bye. So yeah, these are really important interactions to think about, is ways we can support and ways that we should think about these different boundaries and rethink our boundaries in a lot of different ways. Because I think I never really thought about my own personal boundaries and other people's boundaries either. So challenges for teens dating during the pandemic. So one big thing is access to support systems at school. That's a huge one. I've talked to counselors and they've said, I can't really check up on students the way I used to, and a lot of times teachers, friends, people at school might notice that the teen is in an abusive situation. Friends might be like, hey, I don't like the way that they spoke to you after class, or I don't like the way that they were talking to you. And teachers and counselors might be the link to resources like ours at our organization, because I know I talk to a lot of teachers and counselors about links to our resources. So that's something that's really important to think about, is a lot of teens, that's where they get their resources from. And as adults, if we're adult allies here, it's so important to connect teens to these support systems, and be able to be that liaison for them, because a lot of them may not be able to access things. Like, for example, our shelter isn't able to accept folks that are under the age of 18, and that unless they're accompanied by an adult that is experiencing abuse or survivor or something like that. So that's something that's really important to consider, is their access to support systems. Because they're underage, they're oftentimes not able to access things without parental consent, even if sometimes, maybe their parent is being abusive at that point. Mental health issues. So increased isolation can impact relationship dynamics. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, is spending so much time online and on social media. I noticed one thing, that if I read the comments on YouTube videos a lot of time, especially if it's the news, I tend to lose faith in humanity a little bit, because a lot of people tend to say things that they wouldn't normally say to people in person. And I feel like online people feel like there's a freedom to be mean to other people for no reason, rather than constructive criticism. So I think that's something that is a really important time to prioritize, is mental health for young people, especially because your habits that you develop now as a young person under the age of 25 is so important to develop those habits when you're younger, because when you're older it's harder. I won't say it's you can't change habits, but it's just harder because a lot of it's been solidified as a young person, and it's easier to change your habits when you're younger. So that's something that's really important to emphasize. And I don't think emphasize this a lot. A lot of times in abusive situations, sometimes an abuser might say, I'll kill myself if you leave, or something like that. And that really puts into how, that's kind of a boundary for a lot of folks, is, you know, you have to take care of yourself first before you can be in that relationship. Because a lot of times, someone who is depressed or suicidal can cope in a way that's not healthy for other people in a lot of sense, and it can impact other people. I think for me, I have ADHD, and that has impacted my relationships, because I had a hard time with emotional regulation. The way I would get really a lot of meltdowns, or I get really upset easily. Projection sensitivity was really hard for me. So I think that's why it's so important to learn about ways to cope with mental health issues first before you get into a relationship. Because if you don't know why your emotions are happening a certain way, or why you're coping with this thing in different ways, or have strategies to deal with it, it can impact your relationship in really negative ways. And I'm not saying people that have mental health conditions are more likely to be abusive. A lot of times they're more likely to experience uh, abuse from other people. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind there. New rules can be difficult as well. I know for me, I like consistency. I had a schedule before the pandemic, and a lot of that has been kind of turned upside down. And I know for a lot of teens, it can be a difficult adjustment. Limits, like not being able to go out and see your friends, that limits a lot of agency and choice, and being able to have friends and have people that you care about and have a choice to be with those people. And unsafe relationship mediums. So there might be more excessive texting. Maybe you might go on dating websites that may not necessarily be safe for teens, because a lot of times those websites are more meant for adults. There's not really like a safe teen dating platform. And that could be very difficult, because I know in schools, that's where I know for me in high school, that was where like all the relationships happened. So that's something to keep in mind, is that it's hard when you're not in school to have those kind of, there's like, teachers that might notice something, or people that are supportive friends, peers that might see things that might not be necessarily viewable online. So that's really important to have those people to check in on you and make sure, identify when you're not being treated right. So one thing is creative ways to date, thinking about different ways to date outside of the box, because I know especially there's a lot of Zoom fatigue. So maybe writing letters is cute. It like shows that you put effort into something. Old fashioned letters, scrapbooking is really helpful. I started scrapbooking a little bit. And that's really helped me. I started painting too. That was really fun. I was like, oh, I love creative things. So you can do things like exchange paintings of each other, drop them off, cook a meal, drop it off at their house. Those are just kind of like ways to show appreciation when during social distancing times, beating the isolation. See if your school hosts virtual support groups, and if you are looking for support groups and there aren't support groups at your school, feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to connect with anyone's school or any connections out there that you have. So that's something that is really important, is to see if there's virtual support groups out there. Reaching out to friends, and it can take a lot of effort, but I think right now it's really important that we really make a huge effort to reach out to people, just because there's kind of a low motivation to do so because we're all at home and we don't really have that influence or pressure to do so. So it's important to stay in touch with other folks. Family and friend boundaries in the pandemic. So maybe saying, I don't want to talk about the coronavirus right now. That's something I know is like, there's a lot of fatigue talking about it. Understanding you're trying to be helpful with suggestions, but I need space to experience my emotions. I really thought a lot of these are great scripts or ways to talk about how you feel during a pandemic and trying to create those boundaries with other people, and saying, creating those emotional boundaries too, not just physical boundaries. And thinking about having different ways to deal with it. So for families, creating your own space, respecting other space. I know a lot of folks might not have the ability to be in their own room or have a specific office or school, like having a school separation from, maybe you all share one bedroom or something like that. So creating your own space or corner, I have like dividers, so that, because I share a room with my boyfriend, so he's here, and I try to make sure that we have our own space. So that's something that I found really important, is making sure you have space to take care of yourself and do your own thing. New limits, and this is for the adult allies or parents or guardians. So accompanying new limits, so maybe you're not allowed to go see other people right now, or your friends in person, but offering new privileges, like maybe more online time or digital time, or more time playing video games to connect with other people. Because, just setting up an expectation, maybe that, oh, when we're in person again and you're allowed to go see your friends, we're not going to do this anymore. This is just for the time being. Because we have to be kind of understanding that they really need that kind of social interaction, but also making sure you set limits around those new privileges as well, can be really important in setting up the expectation that, this isn't going to be forever, but this is because we want to make sure teens feel okay during this time and they don't feel like everything's being taken away from them, making sure that we can supplement these new limits with new ways that they can express themselves or do something differently while also staying safe during the pandemic. And we're going to go back to the teen hat now. So scheduling alone time and making sure that, because I think when you schedule things, it sets an expectation for how much time they can spend without, someone interrupting them or being in charge of them or telling them what to do. So that can be really important sometimes, to have that time alone, but also know when as a teen, you should be productive, do your homework and other things, setting limits for that. Reasons for physical distancing despite age. I know a lot of times, especially me as a young person in my 20s, I definitely was like, oh, I'm a young person, it's probably not going to affect me, but a lot of young people are impacted by COVID physically, very seriously sometimes. So just because we're a certain age or we don't fit that at-risk category, we really don't know much about this virus. So understanding those reasons why we're physical distancing, maybe we don't want to transmit it to other people, understanding why we have to all wear masks, because that's a big one, that in order to like stop the spread, we all have to wear masks, because masks, as they say, don't protect yourself, but they protect other people. So that's so important. And avoiding accusatory language is really important too, because a lot of times maybe you have differences in the family dynamic where some people take precautions more seriously than other people. Try to be understanding, because I know a lot of people are having this fatigue with COVID. Is like, oh, I don't know if I can really stay, because I know at the beginning I was like, oh my gosh, we have to do this. We have to make sure we disinfect everything, and I know it can be like really easy to, kind of just like, whatever. I don't really care anymore because this has happened for so long. But being understanding of that kind of fatigue is so important, and saying, this is how I feel about this. I'm scared for my health, or I'm scared for this, is so important to kind of express the reasoning behind that and focus on what you can do. I think that's so important, is a lot of times you don't have control over your family members and what precautions they take or what they do, but you can focus on what you can do. Maybe you can wear masks around the house. Maybe you can do other things that make you feel safe. Like maybe you spend more time in your room if you're allowed to. Understanding what you have control of is so important. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But yeah, readjusting to life after herd immunity is going to be really important, because I think a lot of folks think it's going to just be back to normal. Everything's going to be okay. But we still have a lot to deal with after this. I know that we've lost a lot of folks to COVID-19. So there's a lot of trauma. A lot of people are going through grief. There's a lot of loss happening. And I've known people who have died from COVID. And it's going to be hard going back, especially to in-person things. I think there's going to be this fear. Like, I don't think I'll ever touch a doorknob without disinfecting afterwards, ever again for me. So those are some things that, you don't have to get rid of. Those are things that, maybe that was something we needed to be doing already. But, pacing yourself, taking time to get back into the social circle. I know for me, it's going to be hard to go back to restaurants because I haven't been to a restaurant since the pandemic started. Trauma and its effects, understanding, this is a situation of trauma because it's fear combined with a lack of control. So that's something, a subjective experience of a lack of control. So this is something that we've all kind of collectively experienced, is the inability, we don't know what this thing is or what it does. What can we do to prevent it from happening? And now we have more control because of the vaccine, right, is coming out. So that's something, or we might feel we have a lack of control. Can I get the vaccine on time? I know a lot of folks might be scared about, going back to school. Maybe you feel like there's a lack of control there. You don't have control over going back to school if you feel unsafe. And even after it's safe to go back to school and very, very safe to see other people again the same way without masks, trauma is still going to impact us. I was telling my boyfriend the other day, like, it's kind of crazy that we are going to, that, people later on, younger people are not going to know about the pandemic years from now. I know a lot of you teens out there, when you're adults, it's going to be strange talking to younger folks about this pandemic that happened. And to them, that'll be like, oh, that was like a history that happened to us. So just realizing the historical impact that this is going to have unless we deal with it as soon as possible. Try to deal with your mental health as soon as possible. If you're not doing it right now, is really important. Rebuilding relationships is important because you might have not seen people for a while, and sometimes you might just lose touch. So rebuild those relationships, connections, because those are your support systems. If you ever get into a dating violence situation, you need these relationships in your life to go to and to find solace in. And I'm not saying that you should go back to people that you didn't really have a connection with, because I don't think that's really helpful, but rebuild relationships with people that you feel like have supported you in the past in your difficulties. Reflect on the experience, seek help early, and stay hygienic, because I think that's just generally something that the pandemic has taught me. and addressing concerns around wearing masks. So these are just some common concerns that people might feel and are important to acknowledge when you're addressing folks that don't want to wear a mask. So just addressing these first and understanding the reasoning before you get into conflict with someone, and realizing those who have these reasonings feeling like your area is safe or only has a few infections. That's a common belief, but a lot of times we've seen that it spreads so fast. It doesn't really matter if one area is low, like a lower level of cases. It can still spread fast, especially with the new variants too. So having a bit of caution there. I don't want to cause fear in people, but just understanding why it's important to do as much as we can to stay safe. And a reaction to what might feel like too much government control is a big one. Not agreeing that masks help prevent the virus spread of coronavirus, and that's a lot of that is a lot of misinformation out there. And I urge you to look at the CDC website too, and the Washington State Public Health Department's website to kind of really kind of learn about this virus, of what we should be doing, and the guidelines that are available. And not wanting to show fear or vulnerability. And I think a huge one is if we admit that we have to do these precautions, we have to admit that a lot of things are outside of our control. And I understand that that's so scary to think about, is that a lot of things are outside of our control, but wearing a mask, social distancing, physical distancing is so important. And those things are within your control, and knowing what you can do is important. So thinking about things you can control are so important to keep yourself healthy ways of thinking. Sanitizing your hands, removing yourself from spaces when possible, and maybe refraining from traveling, seeing friends in person, getting vaccinated when you can. So just really pay attention to the new guidelines that are coming out, and really following those, because that's really kind of, we're all in this together, and it's kind of a community response that we have to have. We have to be a community. We have to be supportive of each other. And I really, I'm so glad you all came today to be a part of this. So without further ado, I'm going to get to our giveaway. So Tia, congratulations, you won a Target gift card. So thank you so much for being here and participating so much. And this will be on YouTube too. So, so if you want to forward this training to anybody you know, feel free to. We appreciate you being here. And we're doing this giveaway because we believe that, you know, people don't get rewarded for, you know, engaging in things that help the community. So I think your participation in itself, and I'm sure you're going to, you know, do a lot of good work by spreading awareness about dating violence issues and domestic violence issues. So I just think it's so wonderful to reward people who come. And I also want to remind people that you are contributing to preventing dating violence and teen dating violence. And this is the last of our series for Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. So I so appreciate your participation in being here. And that's something that I think is so important. So without further ado, here's some resources on dating violence, resources that you can contact. And a lot of these ones are very supportive. They have, I know the Northwest Network is a really great resources for LGBTQ survivors. They have a lot of youth programs and activities for young people. And thank you, Tia. I appreciate you too. Happy Friday. So thanks for being here, and we'll end today now. So thank you so much.